Hello, everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day. I wish I could see all your beautiful faces in person, but unfortunately, due to the circumstances surrounding us right now, we can't do that, which is really unfortunate. But I'm still happy that you are choosing to listen to my presentation. Speaking of my research, I was examining whether or not there were differences in the coverage between the mainstream media and the ethnic media on Supreme Court decisions. Um, If I asked you, how do you know about the behavior of the Supreme Court? How do you know what it does? How do you know how it's voting? What decision it's making? You'll probably say, I hear it on the news or I read it in the paper, which is good to acknowledge because the media does serve as our primary informant to the Supreme Court's behavior. There are two types of media that I looked at examining in my study. The mainstream media, which informs a large populace. They try to reach out to as many people as they can. They're usually national, um, and they serve a very large, diverse readership. My study also looked at the African American press, which focuses on informing their local African American communities. Um, if you think about the Michigan Citizen, it informs the African Americans of Detroit. At least that's its intended audience, is who it's trying to inform. The Tri-State Defender, it is from Memphis, and it intends to inform the African American population in the Memphis area. Um, and this study examines whether the differences in these readerships causes a difference in the coverage of the Supreme Court decisions between the two sources. My research question was, how will a difference in readership affect the two types of media outlets' coverage of Supreme Court decisions? Um, and I had to examine what the coverage broke down into, and I arrived at um, two different components of what the coverage was. Um, it was the sentiment they expressed, so how positive they were about the decision in their coverage, or how negative they were about the decision, and also whether there was a difference in the values they covered, the frequency of the values. So let's say a Supreme Court case is talking about the First Amendment. That would be the value that the case would cover. And I wanted to see if the value of the case was different in the total coverage. So whether the ethnic media covered one value more than the New York Times. My hypothesis was, I had two hypotheses. One of them was that compared to the mainstream media, I believe the ethnic media would cover different values. I believe we'd see a difference in the values that the two would cover. For me, after examining the literature, I believe that the due process and unions would be covered at a higher rate by the ethnic media compared to the mainstream media. I also believe that there would be a distinct difference in the variability of sentiment for the mainstream media compared to the ethnic media. What that means is that from article to article on different Supreme Court decisions, I believe that there would be a greater difference in the tone expressed by the ethnic media compared to the mainstream media. This is due to the fact that the mainstream media had to reach a wide audience, and most of their coverage would be informational based, while the ethnic media would be more focusing on their local populations and therefore would be more opinionated about the decision. And that would lead to a variance in sentiment that would be expressed by the ethnic papers compared to the mainstream media outlets. So to go about examining this, I looked at cases from 2011 to 2015. This is the last 5-year window where we had a full Supreme Court of the same justices. And the articles were taken from the New York Times to represent the mainstream media, and I used 22 African American outlets to represent the ethnic press. And those were chosen from a previous study that used the same 22 African American outlets. I used a nominal code to represent the central values of each case. The code went from 1 to 14, and each number represented a different value that was the primary focus of the Supreme Court's case. All the articles were extracted from the ProQuest database, and they were turned into text files and examined through RStudio. In RStudio, I also examined the sentiment. So the tone of the press was quantified into being a positive number or negative number between 1 and -1. And I used sentiment R and text blob as the sentiment dictionaries. This being, they had a list of words. Some were positive, given positive scores. Some were given negative scores. And these text dictionaries, when ran through RStudio, would find these words in the articles and then assign that score for the article and give you a score for the article. And we did this for every article, for every Supreme Court case, for the ethnic press, and for the New York Times. So we had a sentiment score, one sentiment score for each case decision for all the articles by the ethnic press and the New York Times. And we were able to compare the average sentiment expressed for the articles on each Supreme Court decision. Our New York Times sample included 489 articles and covered 163 cases, where the African American press had 94 articles and 30 cases. What you see here is a box plot of the sentiment scores, the average sentiment scores for the articles. And what you will notice is that the interquartile range of the ethnic press is larger than the New York Times. You will also notice that the range of the ethnic press is larger in the average sentiment expressed for Supreme Court decisions compared to the New York Times. Big thing to note about the variability of the data is that the variance for the ethnic press was slightly higher than the New York Times. The range was also higher, and the interquartile range was higher for the ethnic press, meaning that they had a wider range and a wider variability of the sentiment they expressed per Supreme Court decision. You'll also note that the total article coverage of the New York Times was higher, and they covered more cases compared to the ethnic press, despite there being 22 ethnic outlets, meaning the ethnic press had not as much resources or did not let enough resources to cover the decisions by the Supreme Court. They didn't dedicate as much time in their paper to dedicating the Supreme Court as other issues. This, you'll note, is a dot plot of the values covered by the New York Times and ethnic press. What you'll notice is that the criminal proceedings by the New York Times was covered as their highest issue. Almost 30% of their articles on the Supreme Court decisions covered cases that were of criminal proceedings, which was higher than the ethnic press. But you'll notice that the ethnic press covered First Amendment, due process, and unions at a higher percentage than the New York Times did with their coverage. So the cases that were being examined by the ethnic press were more likely to be cases that dealt with due process, unions, or First Amendment rights compared to the New York Times. So in conclusion, there are a couple of things that I found. One, I found there was a distinct difference in the amount of coverage. The ethnic press covered decisions less often and less frequently with less articles than the New York Times. The New York Times contributed more articles and covered more cases. The African American outlets, despite covering less articles, had a greater variability in sentiment with their coverage. They had a larger interquartile range, a lot of total range, a larger variance. They had more difference in the sentiment expressed based on the decision of the Supreme Court. And this correlates with the increased racial homogenized populations of the inner cities. So the New York Times is trying to cover all of America, while the African American press outlets usually just focus on their cities. And since the population is more homogenized, that correlated with the variance in sentiment. It was also seen that there was a distinct difference in the types of cases that were covered. The New York Times covered criminal proceedings and economic activities at a higher frequency than the ethnic press, while the African American press covered First Amendment, due process, and unions at a higher percentage. And that's everything I have from my work. I'd like to give a special thank you to my mentors, Mintao and Dr. Eric Waltenburg. They gave me a lot of counsel and guidance. I would like to thank the Purdue Office of Undergraduate Research and Purdue College of Liberal Arts. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me present my research, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.